Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. In the course of a few days, we've seen dramatic developments take place within our neighborhood. Afghanistan has seen a change of regime, it seems, and overnight, US troops decided to withdraw from the country, leaving in its wake a large amount of confusion, some tragic loss of life, and of course, big question marks on what happens next. For India, that is a close neighbor and an economic partner, there are bigger questions to consider. What could be the strategic impact of the fact that we now have a Taliban led regime in the region? What could be the impact in terms of terror breakouts within this region? And what should India's priorities be at this point while dealing with what looks like an unstable regime, or at least a violent regime from past record and past history? Joining me to talk about all of that and to put this entire development so far into perspective is Michael Kugelman. He is Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. Michael, thank you again for joining in and speaking with me. It's not a reasonable amount of time, but some time has passed since this very worrying transition of power in Afghanistan. What seems clear right now? What's the one or two or three things emerging very clearly about the Taliban and Afghanistan now?
Well, I think one thing that is clear is that this next government in Afghanistan will be pretty much dominated by Taliban leaders. There had been this hope that this new government would be able to incorporate some non-Taliban leaders, whether you're talking about those that had served in previous governments or others in the broader political class. And there's been talk of this interim council led by personalities such as Abdullah Abdullah and Hamid Karzai and Golbaran Hekmatyar. But each day that's gone by has sort of indicated to me that the Taliban really feels no need to share power, and that all of this messaging about wanting to incorporate other voices and all that may have been a bit of a sham. And I think the fact that the Taliban leadership has essentially ruled out making any decisions on the final constitution of the government until after the deadline for the final withdrawal, which is August 31st, that suggests a degree of, or a lack of a degree of urgency in terms of trying to cast as wide of a net as possible and having as big of a tent as possible. One thing that we've seen over the last few years with the Taliban is that they've done things on their own terms and they've been able to get away with it, right? I mean, they got an agreement with the US that got US troops to leave. They didn't have to do much in return. They got Ashraf Ghani to leave the country, which they have long wanted. They got the power that they've long sought. And now, despite all this pressure for them to share power, I really don't think they feel there's a need to have a true power sharing arrangement. And this clearly is quite worrisome.
Yeah. What's also very different from 20 years back to now, Michael, is that, at that point, information came in dribs and drabs in terms of what was happening and the true nature of it. Whereas now it's almost bipolar in nature, right? There is, it seems like this well-planned campaign about how the Taliban should be termed, whether they should be termed insurgents or terrorists, or whether Taliban 2.0 looks different, versus the very real video and footage and photographs and narratives that we are getting from people there, which really don't seem to indicate that anything is very different, starkly different from where it was 20 years back.
Yeah, this is true. And we have the benefits of technologies now that were not present several decades ago. And indeed, it allows there to be a form of citizen journalism in which you have local communities, individuals take out their phones and record. This is a very dangerous thing to do, but record cases of brutalities, executions, the revenge killings, all of which the Taliban has done in recent weeks. And indeed, these types of images give the lie to these assurances from the Taliban that things aren't different. Now, it's been several years that the Taliban has sought to market itself as a more moderate version of its former self. And I think that this really began in earnest when it was looking to begin negotiations with the United States. It wanted the US and the broader international community to see it as a responsible stakeholder because the Taliban wanted to get that accord with the US in order to get US troops to leave the country. And it succeeded with that. And you could argue that it does, to an extent, seek legitimacy and recognition from the world so that it can get financial assistance. I think that certainly is a goal. But the more it does that, I mean, that objective is undercut by the fact that you have all of these reports every day, seemingly suggesting that the Taliban hasn't changed at all. Now, I should say that in this current era of social media, there are plenty of inaccurate and false reports of Taliban atrocities as well. I mean, this is important to highlight as well. But at the end of the day, to me, as an analyst, it's very simple, right? I mean, for several decades, the Taliban developed this horrific track record, first as a repressive theocracy, and then more recently as a brutal insurgency. And we cannot expect a group like this to just change its stripes and change its outlook and change its tactics at the flick of a switch. It doesn't work that way. And this is not a group that is going to compromise on its basic ideology, even if it's trying to project a softer side. There may be token gestures, there may be certain things it does. These very well publicized meetings that it has with members of religious minority groups. There had been one meeting with a group of Hazaras. But on the other hand, Amnesty International just recently came out with a report indicating that the Taliban had executed 9 Hazara men in recent weeks. So I think that it's very important that we not take at face value these assurances from the Taliban that it's a more moderate version of its former self.
What's the best way forward in that case, Michael, for governments to deal with the Taliban? I mean, up until now, for example, on the aspect of evacuation, things have been moving more or less smoothly for those who want to leave the country from other nations, that is. But as you said, there is, first of all, a high degree of mistrust. And secondly, you have to question when there's an empire built on violence, whether, it can sustain on anything but violence.
Yeah, it's very difficult to gauge how governments should choose to engage with this new government. And indeed, the immediate priority is on the evacuations. And according to most of the credible reports, the Taliban has not necessarily on very direct levels stood in the way of these evacuations, in the sense that, it's basically Taliban has been standing, the Taliban has a presence outside of the airport. Certainly, it's been giving a hard time to a number of those trying to get in, but there has not been significant levels of violence used by the Taliban against people trying to get into the airport to keep them away. There have been cases of violence for sure, but it's more just chaos and a lack of coordination and lack of organization on the part of the U.S. And broader issues there. So I think that this is sort of a sobering reflection of the situation right there, but. I don't think that if the U.S. and other countries think that by, essentially threatening to withhold financial assistance to the Taliban and by depriving Taliban leaders of accessing Afghan reserves and assets outside of the country, and hoping that by doing that, it'll prompt the Taliban to issue these blanket statements of assurances for women's rights and civil rights and so on and so forth, that's not going to happen. And I think that at some point, the world will have to decide how much it's willing to accept in return for recognizing the Taliban government. And I think that some countries will have lower bars than others in terms of what they would demand for the Taliban before providing recognition. A country like China, for example. Yeah. I don't think China is going to be waiting for clear indications of deeds on the part of the Taliban that suggest that they're going to respect the rights of women. I think China is going to be looking for other types of indications, such as that the Taliban would be willing to deny space to anti-China terror groups like the ETIM, for example. But I think for many Western governments, they will be hoping that by trying to use aid as leverage, it can compel the Taliban to alter its behavior. And this is just not going to be the case. And, some may say, well, the U.S. and others don't really care. They're willing to engage with other governments that are repressive. If you look at the Saudis or the Israelis, there's so many examples. But I think, given the general U.S. narrative, U.S. government narratives about Afghanistan and about the Taliban, the U.S. did not fight a war in Afghanistan to bring about democracy. But I do think that for the U.S., one of its major objectives in Afghanistan has been to see the gains of recent years, better literacy rates, more women in schools, that type of thing. It doesn't want those to be squandered. So I think that's why the U.S. will be very careful. It will not recognize a Taliban government, I think, unless there's indications that it's going to see indications that those gains will be safeguarded. But as I said, the Taliban is not in a position to do that. So that suggests that the US may well end up not recognizing the Taliban government. And I imagine that that will be the case with many of the EU states, other NATO countries as well.
I do want to talk about the US, in more detail, but how have you read the reaction from India or the lack thereof yet?
Well, I think that India has to be very cautious. I mean, it's obviously an extremely sensitive and very delicate moment. I think that there clearly is, and understandably, no sense of what direction India should take at this point. I think at the very least, New Delhi will want to wait to see what the formal, what the government looks like in Afghanistan once it is finally established. I think that's quite clear. We know it's going to be a Taliban-dominated government, but I do think that if there were to be some token representation of non-Taliban personnel in this government, that may make India a bit more comfortable about engaging. But I think that for now, it makes perfect sense that India would take a watching and waiting position just to see how things go. But eventually, India will need to make some difficult decisions, doesn't want to try to capitalize on these recent cases of outreach to the Taliban. I mean, as you know, in recent weeks, for the first time, there were formal official efforts on the part of New Delhi to establish channels of communication with the Taliban. There's no indication that the Taliban has responded to those outreaches from India, but I think that at some point soon, New Delhi will have to make a decision if it wants to pursue that further, because to the extent that India still has assets, equities in Afghanistan, and I think it will for quite some time, it will want to get assurances from the government in Afghanistan that those will remain safe. We have all of these development projects that India has undertaken in Afghanistan in recent years, including this large dam, the Salman Dam, and it wants to ensure that those are safe. Obviously, it's better to get assurances that those interests, those assets will remain safe if you're able to engage with the government. India, in my view, was late to read the writing on the wall in recent months. It was late to come around to the fact that after the US withdrawal, the Taliban was going to remain very strong militarily and politically. And as odious as it may seem to try to engage with such a nasty regime, it's something that you don't have a choice of not doing. You have to do it. So since India was late in the game to start engaging with the government, it's going to have less leverage and influence in this Taliban-led Afghanistan, less leverage than most other countries in the region will have, and it's quite sobering, given that India had previously been Afghanistan's closest friend in the region, and now all of a sudden you're looking at a situation where there may not even be a formal relationship.
Yeah. What do you see as the wider strategic impact for India, though, Michael? Because right at the get-go, there's 3 or 4 clear lines that you can draw: India and the US, India and China, India and Russia. India and the US may well remain, warm in terms of their ties. The fissures might actually deepen between India and China. And then you have this really complicated relationship with Russia. What do you see as perhaps the wider strategic impact for India because of what occurred in Afghanistan?
I think that recent events in Afghanistan have dealt India a major strategic blow. You're going to have a Taliban-led government, which is clearly not a good thing for India. I mean, the Taliban is a group that I think one could regard as an anti-India group. It has targeted Indians in Afghanistan before. It's targeted Indian assets in Afghanistan before. And of course, you're getting a Taliban government, which means that you're going to have a government in Afghanistan that's friendly to Pakistan, which is also a net strategic disadvantage for India. And I think that looking at the broader regional picture, another disadvantage for India is that you're going to have, the broader region is going to have more of an opportunity to deepen its footprint in Afghanistan. But many of the key regional players are either rivals of India or they're countries that have seen their relations with India be worsened in recent years. So I think you're looking at the prospect of potentially Pakistan and China stepping up their roles in Afghanistan. We're looking at countries like Turkey, which have seen their relations with India suffer in recent years. So Turkey has longstanding relations with Afghanistan, but also has a pretty good relationship with the Taliban. The Taliban has praised Turkey as a great Muslim nation. Russia, indeed, is a longstanding partner and friend of India, but that relationship has worsened as well as the US-India relationship has gotten bigger. So I could envision this scenario under which you could have Pakistan, China, and Russia. Russia, of course, has been expanding its own relations with China and Pakistan in recent years. So I could envision this scenario under which you have China, Russia, and Pakistan taking on more of a role in Afghanistan, with India really left on the outside looking in, just because, at least initially, it would lack those links and that leverage that it could potentially exert vis-a-vis the Taliban government. Now, I don't want to jump the gun here. I think that, even countries like Pakistan and China, which I think have good reason to want to do more in Afghanistan and step up their role, they're going to be cautious in the initial term, at least until they get assurances that the security situation in Afghanistan will be calmer. I mean, theoretically, the Taliban has claimed that the war is over. It's not going to fight the war anymore. And indeed, we've had a number of days in Afghanistan without any known deaths, which is extraordinary if you look at almost 40 years of war in Afghanistan. But there's a lot of uncertainties. There likely will be some type of pushback against the Taliban, not necessarily in organized form. I think that the resistance in the Panjshir is not going to last, but there will be pushback. You've got a lot of factions that are armed in Afghanistan and that don't want to see the Taliban stand. You have terrorist threats like ISIS. So I think that amid all this uncertainty, until there's a better sense of how things are going to play out in Afghanistan, you're not going to see these countries rush into Afghanistan pell-mell to start building relations with the Taliban. But if they do get assurances that the security situation is calming down, if the Taliban gives the assurances that the interests and assets of these countries will not be imperiled, then you could well see India's rivals and countries that it's struggling to get along well with move into Afghanistan, develop a deeper footprint. None of that is good for India strategically.
Yeah. Just on this Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship, Michael, two-part question from India's perspective. One, do you think the threat of cross-border terrorism now increases quite significantly? And secondly, given India's own position and narrative over the last couple of years, whether it was about refugees, where very pointed references were made about the fact that all non-Muslim refugees would be welcomed into India, or even at this point in Afghanistan, that seemed to be the early communication from the government. Has that put India in a tougher spot than it might have been a few years back?
Well, I think that certainly the new citizenship law raises some notable questions that one would assume that absolutely, to the extent that you have members of the Afghan Sikh and Hindu community trying to leave Afghanistan, theoretically India should be a welcome venue for them, just because this new citizenship law is meant to expedite fast track citizenship for non-Muslim communities from India's neighbors. But you could conceivably have a large number of Afghan refugees on the whole that are trying to get out of Taliban-led Afghanistan. And I think that just quantitatively, most of them will be Muslims. And indeed, this raises a question that, well, those are not included in the citizenship law's accommodations for those fleeing countries neighboring India. So I think that there's some troubling questions to be posed there. I mean, certainly India does not host anywhere near the number of Afghan refugees that Pakistan and Iran have over the years, but there is a contingent, there is a modest number of Afghan refugees in India. And I think that there could be more pressure on India to allow more to come in. So that certainly will be an issue. Now, in terms of the issue of cross-border terrorism, I think if there's one thing that we could state very clearly and unequivocally about an otherwise very fluid situation, it is that the US withdrawal coupled with the Taliban takeover will have an incredibly intoxicating effect on regional militants. This is what really inspires and galvanizes Islamist militants. Expulsions of foreign troops and major gains, territorial gains by these militants. Al-Qaeda was essentially established after Osama bin Laden's anger at the presence of the US military forces on Saudi soil. So clearly there's going to be a major empowering effect, emboldening effect on these regional militants. And I think that would include the likes of Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. These are groups that have had a small but nonetheless clear presence in Afghanistan over the years. They haven't done much there. They've been fairly quiet, but they're there. They've seen what's happened. They know what's happened. And I do think there's reason to fear that these groups could use the Taliban victories in Afghanistan as inspiration for stepped up attacks in Kashmir. And clearly, the extent to which that happens will depend in great part on Pakistan, on what efforts Pakistan may make to try to discourage these groups, which of course are closely tied to Pakistan, the extent to which Pakistan tries to stop those groups from doing those things. And Pakistan has been under a lot of pressure because of these FATF and other international bodies to rein in these groups and crack down on their infrastructure. So it's not a sure thing, but I think that it's a very real and understandable fear on the part of New Delhi that this Taliban takeover could inspire anti-India militants to step up attacks. It's something that clearly it's a very understandable concern.
Mm. I want to go back to the point you made about the economics of this relationship. I was just looking at the figures where, trade was at about $1.5 billion, but the assistance and aid, etc., from India actually tots up to about $3 billion. There was the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, which again, didn't really see light of day, but there are very critical air freight corridors as well. Who has more to lose in this economic relationship, you think? Is it important for Afghanistan to keep at least trade relations open with India, or is it the other way around?
I mean, theoretically, this Taliban government should be very receptive to trade cooperation, investments from the outside world, just because they need money. They need money, quite frankly. And, this is, we hear so often that the Taliban is a well-funded organization, which it is. I mean, it's been able to make a huge amount of money off of drugs and other illicit industries. But you need a lot more money to run a country than you do to wage an insurgency. I think that's quite clear. And so this is one reason, I think, why the Taliban is trying to project itself as a more moderate force in order to get legitimacy and recognition, because that could bring in international support. So in that regard, yeah, I mean, it should benefit from any continued support that comes from India. But given the dynamics of a potential relationship between the Taliban and India, ideologically, from the Taliban perspective, it wouldn't make sense. So I think that the Taliban may hope to gain recognition from other countries that would be less ideologically opposed to the Taliban and that would be better fits, such as China. I really think that the Taliban is going to try to be very receptive to negotiations with China, resulting in some type of arrangement where Beijing can bring infrastructure investments into Afghanistan. I think that's quite clear. Now, the Taliban in recent months has said very emphatically that it would welcome development projects, infrastructure projects that are foreign backed, so long as they serve Afghan national goals. And clearly, any of these development projects that India has been involved with in Afghanistan meet that criteria. I mean, the Salma Dam clearly serves national development goals. So theoretically, there should be the receptivity from the Taliban, but it's just the fact that we're talking about India. I think that is where there'd be hesitation. And again, going back to what I said before, the fact that India was so late in trying to open up a formal channel of communication with the Taliban, I think that'll make it even more difficult.
Yeah, and it's not just trade, it's also the resources, Michael. For example, so many important waterheads start from Afghanistan. I mean, they don't have formal water treaties, but it does have the potential of going horribly wrong if it wants to. One must question, I guess, that, whether India was thinking about this or watching this, or as you said, did it make any attempt to be even part of the conversation or be at the table when the conversation was happening about how this entire destructuring or walking away or drawing down, as the US calls it, were to take place?
I mean, there had been efforts in previous years on informal levels for India to try to get involved in these discussions and negotiations over Afghanistan's future and over reconciliation. There had been one specific meeting, for example, where you had two retired Indian diplomats that sat in on a meeting, but they were retired. They didn't represent formal government involvement. But I think that, sort of putting myself in India's shoes here, on one level, I can't blame New Delhi for being hesitant to try to get more involved, just because, it saw an organization, the Taliban, that was an anti-India organization that was very close to Pakistan. And then it saw an emerging reconciliation process beginning, in which the US negotiated with the Taliban while leaving out Kabul, a close friend of India's. And then India saw the regional dynamics of this reconciliation process building, in which some of the biggest actors, so to speak, those playing the biggest role, were the likes of Pakistan and then later China. It really left India out. So, but yes, to answer your question, I do think that it was not the best move in retrospect. In hindsight, we can say that. Just because it was clear to everyone that no matter what was going to happen after the US left Afghanistan, the Taliban was only going to get stronger militarily and politically. No one could have expected the Taliban would have taken over power, but everyone could have, including India, could have predicted that the Taliban was going to remain strong, and it simply got to a point where it didn't make sense not to engage anymore. And I think what you saw in recent weeks was efforts on the part of the Indian government to be involved in the regional meetings on the future of Afghanistan. So Dr. Jaishankar was increasingly present in some of these meetings of Central and South Asian states focused on Afghanistan, which is great. But I think at that point it was too late, and this last-minute effort to reach out to the Taliban, it really, I think, came too late in the grand scheme of things.
Which brings me to this process of withdrawal by the US, Michael. At the start, the perception seemed to be that within the country, there was a lot of support for the decision that Biden had taken, but internationally, there was a lot of criticism and pushback. Is it still that way?
Yeah, it's a very complex matter. The interesting thing is that in the United States, the war in Afghanistan has long been invisible, and people just don't talk about it. It doesn't register on the public conscience in a big way. Even in Washington, in policy debates, it really didn't figure very prominently, especially since the end of 2014, when the U.S. combat mission in Afghanistan formally ended, and the U.S. troops that remained were transitioned into this training and advising missions, which did not involve combat. Over the last few years, there have been plenty of Americans, quite frankly, that didn't know that the U.S. still had troops in Afghanistan. But public opinion polls have shown that to the extent that Americans know that Americans are in Afghanistan and that there's still this U.S. role, the war was an unpopular one. I mean, that's quite clear. And so there's an irony here in that President Biden decided to withdraw from Afghanistan for a number of reasons, but one of them was a belief that the U.S. public would not support an extended U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. This is also why he opposed the surge during the Obama era, I should say. But at any rate, the irony is that given what has happened in Afghanistan over the last week or so, Biden is really getting hammered. I'm not saying that you're having huge mass protests across America opposing what's going on in Afghanistan and opposing Biden's moves, but he's getting hammered. He's certainly getting hammered on Capitol Hill. He's facing a lot of criticism. And I think that many Americans are just horrified at the images they've seen, particularly the really striking ones, the really horrific ones, like these U.S. airplanes taking off with Afghans literally clinging to them. Yeah. This has such an impact on U.S. credibility, on its global standing, and this is something that many Americans don't want. So my point here is that while it's too early to tell at this point, Biden hoped to withdraw because that would be the right thing to do from a domestic political perspective in the U.S. But as things have turned out, his decision to withdraw, and especially his dreadful execution of the withdrawal, could have in time a domestic political cost for him. It could impact him deleteriously politically in the United States.
Mm. Do you foresee any ramifications for them at an international level as well? Because like you said, I guess it was meant to, tie in with the 9/11 anniversary. The stand seems to be that, look, we're in a much better place than we were 20 years back in terms of countering terrorism. But, and I was struck by a tweet that you wrote out about how in his press conference, he seemed tone deaf about the human value and the human loss or the tragedy that was unfolding with them pulling out from Afghanistan.
Well, yeah, it's striking that so many of Biden's strengths have seemingly left him in recent days. Indeed, he had been seen as a presidential candidate who emphasized compassion and empathy and pathos. He sought to contrast himself with Donald Trump on that front. But indeed, I mean, you're not hearing that at all in his messaging. And then also, this was arguably the most experienced administration in years when it comes to foreign policy. You had so many seasoned foreign policy professionals in this administration from the very top on down. So one would think that that type of experienced administration would get this right. It would get things right. It would know how to anticipate, how to prepare a quick evacuation, quick withdrawal. But that clearly was not the case. So, I think that it really is quite surprising, and I really don't have an answer right now. But in terms of the impacts reputationally and all that, to emphasize, to clarify that the U.S. decision to withdraw, that in of itself is not something that has undermined U.S. credibility or U.S. global standing. I think that the president had made a pretty strong case, and I should say I supported the idea of a withdrawal. He made a strong case that the U.S. has done everything that it could, that no matter what it did, no matter how long it kept troops in Afghanistan, that was not going to defeat the Taliban, it was not even going to tame it, and it was better to bring troops home and continue to support the negotiation process. The president also made an important point that if you had kept U.S. troops in Afghanistan, the Taliban would have essentially gone back to war with the U.S. The U.S.-Taliban deal in February 2020 essentially stipulated that U.S. troops will leave Afghanistan and the Taliban will not attack them on their way out. But if Biden had decided to keep troops in the country, the Taliban would have read that as a violation of that agreement. And in all likelihood, the Taliban would have started attacking or trying to attack U.S. troops again. And that would have made it more difficult for the U.S. to continue its focus on training and advising Afghan troops. So that's a pretty strong case. But clearly, I cannot imagine that U.S. credibility will not be undermined, at least to an extent, in the coming weeks and months, just because of these images, right? I mean, the airport images, you cannot look away from those. And despite what the administration may say, that U.S. credibility still remains strong, clearly, NATO partners, treaty allies are horrified about what happened, as well as the risks or the crisis that plunged the safety of diplomats from NATO countries into uncertainty. The blame does lie on the U.S. in this regard. But final point on this: I don't want to overstate the impact on U.S. credibility and U.S. global standing. If the U.S. in the coming weeks and months can work with its allies and its partners, and it can work multilaterally to come up with plans to ensure that Afghans get the humanitarian assistance they need and ensure that those that want to leave are able to leave. And if the U.S. continues to work multilaterally with its partners and others to do what Biden has said he'd like to do, and that is to cooperate on pursuing and addressing shared threats, whether you're talking about competition with China or climate change or other things, that will help. But I think that it was a shock to the system for many around the world that this administration, which pledged to be so different from the Trump administration, it wasn't only going to be about America first, it was going to be working closely with allies, keeping people informed, and doing things right and professionally with experienced personnel at the top. That all came shattering down, given what happened over the last week or so.
Which brings me, Michael, to the most important constituent in this entire story, which is the people themselves. Already there are reports of what is happening over there. Women journalists are being pulled off air. Universities are now considering segregated classrooms for women and men. So it's obvious, the gender impact is very clear, as it is for the population itself. Do you think this goes from the first shock impact into becoming a side story, or do you think that there is potential over here for some kind of massive change, perhaps triggered by the people themselves?
Well, it has been heartening that you have had some peaceful expressions of opposition to the Taliban takeover. This has been very clear. And unfortunately, there have also been reports of the Taliban cracking down violently against these peaceful forms of expression. But I think it really depends on the Taliban and how far it takes this system. If it really is going to return to how things were in the 1990s, which I fear it will,
Yeah.
it's going to be tough for there to be. I mean, I don't want to say that people won't push back. They will, and it'll be easier for them to push back than it was in the 90s for reasons that we mentioned earlier: the profusion of technology, the ability to post messages on social media and get the word out that way. But it will be very difficult, especially without the presence of powerful advocates on the ground to assist these individuals. It's going to be very tough. But here, I think you could look at a very important constituency, and that is the Afghan diaspora. As you know, you've got very large, vocal, organized advocates for Afghanistan within the diaspora in the US, in the UK, in Australia, in other places as well. And I think we could look to them to try to give voice to the concerns and grievances of Afghans in Afghanistan who are unable to get their voices out for whatever reason, whether it's Taliban crackdowns or repression or whatever the case may be. But this will continue to be a major issue for the West, for the United States in particular, which, as I had said earlier, does not want to see these gains of recent years squandered. You could argue there have not been all that many gains in Afghanistan in recent years, but certainly on societal and human development levels, the advances with public health, women's health, and of course, women's education, and so on. I think that pressure will continue to be on the Taliban about that. Now, whether the Taliban is going to address any of these concerns, it likely won't. But I think that at least the sympathies and the advocacy and the pressure campaigns, that will continue in ways that we really did not see in the 1990s when you had this pariah state in Afghanistan doing these terrible things, but it didn't get all that much attention, of course, until the 9/11 attacks came around. So, I'm not saying the U.S. is going to send troops back to Afghanistan to try to launch another war to knock the Taliban out of power. We're not going to see that. But I do think at least the advocacy and efforts to highlight the plight of the Afghan people and try to build channels, discuss ways to push back against that and try to use leverage, whether it entails aid or whatever the case, those efforts will be made. But unfortunately, I think that the ability to get the types of desired outcomes that these advocates would want, I think that those could be limited.
Yeah, I guess important lessons for larger nations as well that attempt to tie their own self-interests with nation building for others. You can't do it. You have to let the people do it for themselves. Just one final question, and I know I'm asking you to stick your neck out here, Michael. There was a point in time where South Asia, the region that we live in, was truly the hot spot in terms of being terror-ridden and being an intensely conflict-ridden zone. What would you say the likelihood is of us going back to that state from the cocktail that we've got going here right now?
Yeah, certainly it is a very critical moment, a very vulnerable moment for the region in terms of potential threats from terrorism. I think if the Taliban does nothing about the presence of these different terror groups on its soil, then I think we have a whole lot to worry about. I do think the Taliban may be selective. It may try to deny space to some of these groups. ISIS, for example, has always been a rival of the Taliban. So I think the Taliban may continue to try to push back against that group. But some of these other groups, the India-focused groups, even the Pakistani Taliban, for that matter, I'm not sure the extent to which the Taliban is going to try to crack down on these groups. But all that said, I don't think we should overstate this idea that it's just a matter of time before Afghanistan becomes this horrible terrorist sanctuary, and we're going to have a repeat of the 9/11 era. Most of the really big name groups are not as strong as they used to be. Al-Qaeda is not as strong as it used to be. ISIS is resilient, but it has a lot of problems in Afghanistan. It doesn't have any clear partners because it's a rival of Taliban and Al-Qaeda. As a Salafist outfit, it's unwilling to work with any other group doesn't embrace Salafism. And most of these regional militant groups, they're Deobandi. They embrace Deobandism. So that sort of constrains its options. But the risk is there for sure. And I think that we had for quite some time, it appeared that the most logical lens through which to look at South Asia in recent years would have been increasing India-China rivalry. But I think that this Taliban takeover, which really took many by surprise, suggests that the terrorism angle could come back into focus, and that could unfortunately become a necessary new lens through which to regard the region. A lot of this, of course, comes down to how the different players and the different actors address this threat. Pakistan is hoping to pressure the Afghan Taliban to crack down on the Pakistani Taliban. The Pakistanis may also try to get some type of negotiation or an agreement with the TTP to get it to stop fighting, to get it to stop attacking. Pakistani government did that in the past. It did not work at all, but they may try to do that as well. So I think that it really comes down to how a lot of different actors, not just the Taliban, choose to respond. But let's be very clear. I think that the specter of regional terrorism has once again become a very real threat in ways that it had not been for quite some time.
Indeed, troubling times, and perhaps hitting us at a time when we are in any case quite vulnerable post-COVID, economically and otherwise. It's always such a pleasure speaking with you, Michael. Thank you so much for taking time out and chatting with me. Thanks again today.
Always a pleasure to talk with you, Mitali. Thanks for having me.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.